So now that we've got our metaphysical system a little bit in line and structured, I want to take a look at the causal mechanisms themselves, and we can explore those a little bit and some of the interesting metaphysical and ontological ramifications that come from the idea of the causal mechanisms. Now remember, in total abstract reality, we've decided that there exists mechanisms, which are logic structures of particular kinds, integrated in such a way that the behavior of the whole system cannot be reduced to the behavior of any of the parts. So when I say a mechanism or a logic structure or a logic gate, I'm actually referring to a whole entire causal entity that's made up of lots of mechanisms and lots of logic gates wired in such a way that they're irreducible. Okay? And that these mechanisms contain within themselves a repertoire of possible systems, whole system states, that by perturbing the mechanism reduces uncertainty about which system state it actually was and generates a conscious state. That is a reduction of uncertainty. So another way to think about this is that each mechanism contains a repertoire of possible conscious states, quality shapes, that it can generate. The quality states are not the same thing as the mechanisms. They are abstract geometric shapes in Platonic qualia space, which are nonetheless necessarily associated with one or more particular mechanisms that could generate that state. So there's a double layer here. There's the mechanisms, and then there's the qualia shapes, and then there's the associations that a qualia state can make to a mechanism. So if a mechanism can generate a qualia state, there you could draw a line between the two. And you know, most qualia states, I believe, are capable of multiple realizability. There are many mechanisms which can generate one particular conscious qualia shape. Okay. Now let's talk about how this relates to theological issues and concepts of necessity and potentiality. No question that God is necessary, right? God, in the traditional vision, is pure act. He is devoid of all potency. There is no potential in God. God is pure actuality. He is the thing which grounds the actualization of all potentials, and therefore is himself devoid of all potential, and that's necessarily who he is. And another way to put this is that the question of does God exist is the same thing as the question of must God exist. It's the same question. Does God exist and must God exist is the same question, because if God exists, he must exist, and he does exist, and he must exist. He is pure actuality. In relation to qualia shapes, it gets very speculative, but I think the best way to think about it is like a super qualia shape, which has a particular unique potentiality structure, such that it intrinsically necessarily exists and contains within it the knowledge of its own shape, all the potentiality of what it could be. But as it relates to all of contingent reality, God is necessary, whereas most conscious states, like you and I, are contingent. Now, even though we are contingent, there's something very interesting that we can know. We can know from within experience that we are contingent. I know that I do not contain within myself the understanding of my own causal necessity. I don't have my own causal necessity. I could have not existed. I can experience that through the nature of my being, my own contingency. But I can also know something else very interesting. Once actualized, once real and made from potential to actual, I can know from within experience that I'm necessarily potential. Now that's interesting. That means that not even God could have made me impossible. What is potential is determined by nothing. Let me say that again. What is potential is determined by nothing. Not even God can change the potentialities. The potentialities are, in fact, the one thing God knows. God knows what is potential because he is purely actual. This implies that the mechanisms, all abstract possible integrated logical structures are too necessary. They're necessary. They're necessary as well. How are they necessary? This is an interesting ontological question. On one hand, should we see them as just logic structures in the mind of God? Or should we see them as actually sort of out there in the world, in the spatio-temporal world, and then God is outside the world actualizing things in the world? Neither, I think. I think that the former is closer, but neither. I think the correct way to look at this is to know that since the potentialities are real, and that these logical mechanisms are real, and necessarily real, they nonetheless are not part of God's immediate subjective. He relates to them as an outside. You see, in this, the necessity of the potentials is I think within God the subject-object distinction. And this is very important. That the subject-object distinction is God's relation to the necessity of all the potentialities. Ultimately, all the mechanisms, all the logic gates, integrated structures, which necessarily exist, and which have the power, if perturbed, to generate actualized contingent states. This necessity, whether one wants to see it as part of God or not part of God, I think the best way to see it is that God's actuality generates the necessity of the mechanisms, but the necessity of the mechanisms generates the actuality of God, because you see, the potentials must be not just potentially potential, actual potentials, things that are potentially actual. There must really be a real mechanism to really make them actual. That it must actually be possible, truly possible, for a contingent state to become actual. And so the necessity of the potentiality of the mechanisms, and the unavoidable existence of the mechanisms, which just must exist because potentially they exert their own existence. It cannot be the case that for example, your current state was impossible. It just was a metaphysical possibility. And this necessitates also the existence of God as the actualizer, a sort of masculine principle. The actualizer. People say he's the creator. I think a better term is the actualizer. I mean, it sounds like a battery brand, but maybe that's not a bad thing. I don't know. It's interesting to ask what else is necessary other than God. And I'm not sure we're even talking about something outside of God, but I think we're talking about a feature within God that God relates to as an object within his subjectivity. And that's the reality of these mechanisms. Okay, so I hope that's moderately clear. I mean, it's kind of a weird topic. Again, we have the basic structure down, but I want to go a little further and talk about something that the integrated information theory predicts. It says for any real potential, if the potential is real, a conscious state will be generated, even if a mechanism is totally unperturbed, silent. A silent mechanism will still necessarily generate, if it's real, if it's working, will still generate a conscious state, albeit maybe a maximally void conscious state given that size of a mechanism, how much information is generated automatically by the mechanism, how many bits. So, this implies that not even God could have prevented at least, void-like states from existing. That they're at least necessary unless God chooses to actualize a mechanism by perturbing it and therefore generating and actualizing more differentiated, nuanced conscious states. But you could say the counterfactual holds that if he were not to actualize anything outside of himself, which would be sort of the passive God, nonetheless the void states would have been necessary because the mechanisms are necessary and they're necessarily actual. I mean, the potentiality has to be real. And therefore, even though no particular contingent conscious state necessarily exists within the contingencies of the mechanisms, at least something is actualized, even if it's just a void state. I mean, this is an interesting aspect of what the theory implies about how reality functions. In a sense, God must create something, even if by passively he's just creating the void. Not even God can stop it. His actualization demands that the mechanisms be in a state. And how to relate what his form is and how he relates to this system of mechanisms and qualia shapes is a complicated story, and it gets into complicated issues about his necessary actualization as a particular form which has a particular structure that it contains the complete knowledge of potentiality within its geometric perfection and symmetrical perfection. That's really it for now. Think about the mechanisms again as the structures of potentiality which contain repertoires of possible conscious states and which necessarily exist, just as God necessarily exists. And it's their relationship that defines God. And then you can start to get into more metaphorical ways of seeing this. And a lot of things become revealed, and we'll go into that. You know, a lot of nature hides this dynamic.